Welcome back to Up North at 4. Last week, the Sioux Line Historical Society met in Rhinelander, and their presentation focused on the history of railroads in our city and how they shaped modern-day Rhinelander. I was able to sit down with one of those historians, John Fredrickson, to learn more about the railway's origin. Check it out. John, before we dive into this, I am just curious, for my sake, how did you start researching and how did you get interested in learning about the railroads, especially as they pertain to Rhinelander?
Well, I grew up in Rhinelander, and I got to see the trains come and go on both the Chicago Northwestern and the Sioux Line. And so I found the passenger trains and the freight trains and the switch engine all to be very fascinating. And so later in life, I had the opportunity to do some research, old Rhinelander Daily News articles and articles about the history of the railroads themselves. And so I put together an article for the Sioux Line Historical Society quarterly magazine, and the article was rather large. It got spread over 2 issues. Mm-hmm. Then when I heard about the convention, I volunteered to be a presenter.
And so that leads us to today. And of course, you know, I always knew as a Wisconsin native that nearly every single small town or city, especially in Wisconsin, has some sort of a connection to the rail lines. What I didn't know, though, about Rhinelander is that there's really 3 railroads that came through town here. Tell me a little bit about that, John.
Well, the first to arrive was named the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western. And it arrived with a spur branch line from Monaco Junction in November of 1882. And prior to that, the area was known as Pelican Rapids. But the family that sponsored the railroad and the sawmill was the Brown family, and they had applied for a post office in September 1882, 2 months prior to the arrival of the railroad. And they had put the name Rhinelander on the application, and that was for Frederick W. Rhinelander, who was president of the Lakeshore. And they thought maybe he would take an interest and invest in the community. He never did. He sold the Lakeshore to the Chicago Northwestern in 1893. And the second railroad to show up was the Sioux Line, and it was being built from Minneapolis to Sault Ste. Marie, which is unusual. Most railroads are built from east to west. The Sioux Line was built from west to east, and the motivation was greed and frustration. The wheat farmers of North Dakota, the flour millers, Pillsbury, et cetera, Minneapolis were frustrated with the freight rates and the service through Chicago. And so they opted to bypass Chicago and went up to Sault Ste. Marie, where they connected with the Canadian railroads and then back down to the East Coast via that route. Mm-hmm. And so it was 500 desolate miles between Minneapolis and Sault Ste. Marie. And Rhinelander was one of the important stop-off points in between on that line. Both the Northwestern and the Brown family collaborated to get that second railroad. And then the third railroad was the narrow gauge. And if you stop by Pioneer Park, you'll notice there's a narrow gauge steam locomotive there. And that was the Thunder Lake narrow gauge, also a common carrier called the Robbins Company.
So, and you mentioned the Sioux Line was, I believe you said it was built by greed and frustration. So is it really fair to say that we can kind of owe current day Rhinelander to some fed up farmers out in like the Dakotas? Is that what I'm hearing from you, John?
Well, they had money, and they built themselves a proper railroad.
Back to Up North at 4, and as we saw in part 1 of my interview with John Fredrickson, Rhinelander began to develop over time with 3 separate railways converging onto the city. But like most towns in Wisconsin, that industry began to fade away, and we touched on that demise of the railroads in part 2. Check it out. It is, I think, very fascinating to look back and hear these stories and hear about this bygone era, because like you mentioned too, you know, growing up as a kid, I would always see these tracks, but I never saw trains running on them. I always saw them kind of get covered with growth and brush and whatever else from the woods, and you never really realize until after the fact that there was this whole industry that really developed and built Wisconsin, and I think led it to where it is today, especially Rhinelander. It really is a different era, and I think it's important for a lot of people to just learn and know more about it. I mean, do you feel the same, or am I off base with that?
Well, if you want to appreciate where you're going, you might want to appreciate where you came from. And obviously the technology that appeared to be a forever technology called the railroads. Railroads are still important in America. You know, I live here in Kent, Washington. Regularly, there's 14,000 ton unit coal trains that roll through, and unit grain trains that roll through, and garbage trains that roll through, and stack trains that roll through. So railroads are still a primary means of transportation. But the term I kind of coined in this presentation was you got to go from somewhere to somewhere. In other words, if you're going from Chicago to Los Angeles, that'll support a passenger train and a lot of freight service. If you're going from Minneapolis to Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, that's kind of like somewhere to nowhere. And if you're going from Chicago to Ashland, Wisconsin, that's kind of like somewhere to nowhere. And so railroads that went from somewhere to nowhere probably weren't going to survive. And they could have been prolonged a little bit. I think the government pulled off the mail and did their best to discourage their demise. But in fact, the public wants better roads. The public wants their own vehicle where they can go exactly where they want, when they want. But then the community is not well served. You know, if you come to Rhinelander and you want to go somewhere, you better have an automobile because there's no bus, there's no train, and the airplane only goes to Minneapolis. So anyhow, that was the demise of the railroads. And I don't think anybody could have done anything to reverse that change of technology and that trend line.
It's just the natural evolution, I guess, if you will. And John, I will say this has been very enlightening, very fun to listen and learn about, you know, this city that both of us at some point in time have called home, which is really cool. Well, John, I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. I'm going to let you go, but we're going to take a break. Be right back on A Burned That For.